Welcome to Product Academy Tough Stuff, the podcast where we cut through the noise and get straight to the toughest challenges in product management. I'm Tanya Lau.
And I'm Francesca Cortesi.
In each episode, we tackle one tough question. No fluff, no filler. Just candid insights from seasoned product leaders.
Our guests deliver actionable, real-world answers. Whether you're an experienced product leader or just stepping into the product world, this is your go-to podcast for sharp, tested advice, condensed for your busy schedule.
One tough challenge, practical insights, short and real.
Let's dive in. Hello, Radhika, and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Francesca. It's good to see you again after Productized.
Oh, the same. And actually, this conversation started with you on a stage and me being really provoked by your talk about a radical take on OKR. And today's tough question is, how do I make OKR work? And I think that a lot of us, me included, are really thinking about it because more or less everybody works with OKR. And more or less everybody thinks that working with OKR is really, really hard. And one thing that you said in that talk, an image that really stuck with me, is that OKR are only a duct tape of the cracks that you have within your company if your vision and strategy are not in place. So maybe before getting to actions on how we make OKR work, we can talk about why OKR do not work.
Yes, that sounds great. Let me share a little bit of background before I get into this topic of how I came to this realization that OKRs are like duct tape on cracks. I too have struggled with OKRs in organizations, and I've seen a lot of behaviors. And this is what I was talking about at Productize, where I was asking people, like, tell me if you've seen this, right? And let's do this with our listeners. One of the behaviors I see is sandbagging, that you feel like, if you set OKRs that are too hard, well, you're setting your team up for failure. And it's like this end of this year exam that even the most ambitious people are going to be like, okay, but I don't want to set up someone for failure. And it's not like, just because my goals are set lower, I'm not going to work harder and achieve more. But like, in fact, when you set goals, if they're too hard, it's demotivating. If they're not hard, there's this fear that, people are just going to pause after that. And honestly, if people are burnt out, they will pause after that. So there's this fear of sandbagging, and I've seen it happen as well, right? Then there's the second piece, which is that you set OKRs, and what ends up happening is it deters people from experimenting. Why? Because OKRs mean that you're just tracking specific metrics that you're optimizing for, which means that, what I hear from people is, I feel limited by what I can do when I have these OKRs, that I feel like I have to achieve these OKRs, but in reality, I've discovered that these other things are important. And there are some other phenomena as well, but I'll mention just one more, which I find super important, which is that people then ask me, how do I frame these metrics for management? Right? And
the process run us at that point.
Right. And the point of that, right, is like we no longer have this attitude of genuinely questioning and experimenting and asking, are these metrics telling me something about what is working or what's not working? At that point, just like an end of the year exam, I just want to show that, listen, I got an A plus. And nobody, like no high achieving person wants to show that they failed. And so you're going to see that people are driving towards demonstrating this A and A plus that they achieved. Whereas what you really want is for people to look at metrics that look both at good metrics and bad metrics so that you can truly evaluate what's working or not, right? So this is why I've seen that OKRs don't work. And so the next question... Yeah, go on.
Radhika, because when you're talking about this, and I recognize myself in many of those, and the endless discussion of like OKRs that are binary or not binary, they're too high, they're too low, or like it becomes that the goal becomes the goals in itself. So we don't really understand what the goal tells us, but it's more the goals for goal's sake.
Exactly.
And that is basically doesn't help us.
Exactly. And, to which people just have, a lot of OKR experts just have very sort of tidbit advice like, oh, this just means you have to set OKRs right. But, but, just as you described, somehow all of us seem to not be setting OKRs right.
Yeah.
Another example is I hear this tidbit advice of, oh, you just need to set OKRs more often, be able to change them as time goes. But that advice too, I've found to never work. In fact, like I've seen an expert suggest this to an executive at a large company who then looked at this expert and went like, yes, except we'll die if we have to set OKRs that often. It takes so long to set and negotiate across different teams, etc. You just cannot keep changing OKRs that often. And so this is why you end up with OKRs that you're stuck with once you've set them at the beginning of the year.
Can I also, like in my experience, what also happens, and I mean, first, obviously, the amount of hours that you put into OKRs, and everyone is like drained at the end of the process. But it's also, if you try to be a little bit more flexible and you change them too often, then the discussion that I had is that the feeling was that we were changing strategy all the time. So it was impossible to keep like direction. So you wanted to adjust the goals, but the feeling was that the direction was changing all the time. So that didn't help either.
You're so right. That's exactly it. Like exactly as you described, there's no winning, right? And so what I realized is we have to ask this question, why are we even setting OKRs? Like what's the impetus from management to set OKRs? And I started doing a lot of research, right? Like why did we come up with OKRs? And if you do a quick Google search, what it says is people set OKRs because they want to define the narrative of the impact that they want to create. And then that begs the question for me, which is, why do you need goals to set the narrative of the impact? Like, why can't you have a vision that sets this narrative? And that's when I realized that we're setting duct tape as the solution to these foundational cracks, right? Where our vision statements are broad brushstrokes, like, we want to be the leader in aerospace engineer or aerospace industry. That's Boeing's vision, right? We want to empower humans to make progress. And that's Snapchat's vision, which is contributing to human progress by empowering people to express themselves, right? What does that even mean? It all sounds...
I mean, so many things. I mean, all the companies in this world more or less can have the same vision.
Exactly. Like empowering people to express themselves. My kid's piano teacher is empowering them to express themselves. It could be her vision. Exactly as you said, it can be anyone's vision. And so in the absence of clarity from a clear vision, you have to resort to goals to be able to set, here's what we're actually going to do. And so then you run into all the side effects of goals. And even this goal setting, right? The reason that we decided that goal setting is the solution is because if you look at just historically kind of what has happened, we realized, long ago that measurement was important, like all the way from the days of Lord Kelvin, who says, when you measure something and you can quantify something, it's like you really know something about something. So great. We realized measurement was important. And then at some point, right, there was this concept of SMART goals that was introduced. And all of a sudden it seemed like you're not smart if you're not setting goals. And so then eventually, right, we went from SMART goals in the 1980s to this concept of big data. Like we all remember there was a stage in life where all we heard about was big data. And that was like in the early, 2010s. So 2012, 2013, everyone was going on about big data. And then the evolution from big data, because everyone's doing big data and collecting data. Then from that, it became data driven, where everyone had to be data driven. Like if you're not data driven, then you're not doing it right. And, it's as if like data guides what decisions you make. And so you combine these concepts of being data driven and having SMART goals. And that's how, OKRs were sort of caught on like wildfire. OKRs combine these things that are so inherent to our psyche now, where we know we have to set goals. And we know that everything has to be quantified. Like, unless you're quantifying things, you're not being data driven. And so you combine those two concepts, and everyone's like, okay, we have to set OKRs. And that's where, OKRs have caught on like wildfire, but they've become this duct tape to address this fundamental issue that we're not that we're not clarifying vision, that we're not creating alignment in teams based on what is it that we're actually trying to solve. What is our vision for the problem? Why does it need to be solved? What's the end state in terms of solution? We don't have clarity in terms of a strategy. We don't, often use our strategy to define, what are the pain points? Like, what have we actually observed in our users to be able to define pain points in a lot of detail? We haven't designed, what are the solutions to those pain points and solving those? What does it mean for our underlying capabilities? And then thinking about how are all of those elements related to our business model. It's more like, let's just throw something out there. We'll throw on a subscription model and then we'll set goals. This is sort of how we end up thinking that we need to build businesses. But what I suggest instead as a solution, instead of OKRs, is let's go back to the fundamentals. Having a detailed vision that I described, a detailed strategy that I was just talking about, and most importantly, instead of the OKR model, coming up with the OHL model, which is objectives, hypotheses, and learnings. Like, actually thinking about vision and strategy, and then saying, how will we translate that into a set of hypotheses? And then measurement to say, how will I validate those hypotheses?
I mean, there's so many interesting things that you're saying here. I mean, all the way I can just plus one of like all that's like we want to use numbers or goals to drive forward, like to measure, but then we get driven by those. I mean, we just like follow. But there is one thing that I think it's, and we had a little bit of discussion about this on LinkedIn, because I totally buy in on the fact that we need to have clear on our vision. We need to have clear what are the problems we're solving, how are we making money of those solving those problems, and have a way, in a way or another. I think like measuring progress is also really important because it gives us like right or wrong direction and so on. And maybe OKR are not the best, but on the other side, many times we don't have the power of changing that framework, right? I mean, we also some on the one side we might not have the power. The other side, there could also happen that, I mean, people, for the good and the bad, in the companies, all the different stakeholders are now used to OKRs. Like, I remember like maybe 10 years ago when I started with OKRs, there was like this convincing of using OKRs because numbers were not even a thing, right? And then we started, on that perspective, OKRs are still good because they give some kind of progress. But I mean, you need something, and people are used to it, and sometimes the cost of change becomes too big. So what I'm thinking about, even if we're, how do we solve this? This is maybe the tough question, right? I mean, we might, as product person, anyone working with product or those OKRs, they have this gut feel that they're not working, that they're like, we're measuring the wrong things. They're like, there is this test at the end of the year. It's like they're not serving us, we're serving them. Yet we cannot revolutionize where we are. So we have those boundaries somehow. You were talking about defining hypothesis. How can one transition, kind of fake it till you make it, like using the OKR boundaries while actually moving in the right direction? Do you have any concrete suggestion on how to do it?
Yes, and I so agree. Like, if you're stuck in this OKR model that is used within your company, like, what do you do as a product manager, even if you hate OKRs?
Yeah.
And the approach that I've used in organizations is having to unfortunately do some re-education, right? Like, even if you have OKRs that you have to achieve, being able to translate OKRs into, hypotheses that you think are relevant for your product. So creating a detailed enough vision and strategy, and you can use the radical product thinking format for that. There's a detailed vision statement, which is a fill in the blanks format, detailed strategy. But my point is, from each of those, crafting a set of hypotheses and sharing those hypotheses with your stakeholders to be able to say, here are our hypotheses, and then talking about how are we going to measure those hypotheses. Moving away from OKRs doesn't mean that we're any less rigorous about measurement or metrics, right? On the contrary, we are taking a more deliberate approach to measurement, and we want to create an environment of collaborative learning. So if you do a little bit of education with your key stakeholders, being able to say that, look, here are the OKRs we're talking about, but the whole point of OKRs is that it's supposed to be both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. You might set these OKRs, but I, as a product manager, also have to be able to tell you that here's, from a product perspective, what I think is important. And so what happens often as a product person is we haven't had the bandwidth to be able to craft our own picture of what are the hypotheses that I think we should be testing. So you have OKRs top down, but you don't have any counteracting force that says, okay, here's what I think are our hypotheses, right? So if you can also take some time to formulate your hypotheses, how will you measure and test whether those are working or not? And, set up processes and meetings first within your own team to be able to talk about, here are the metrics that we're seeing, and what is it telling us about our hypotheses? Is this working? Is it not? And then being able to share those hypotheses and create this. You're going to have to do some buy-in with stakeholders even in advance to be able to say, look, I need to create this environment of collaborative learning. We are going to talk about good metrics and bad. Give them even a heads up that here's what you're seeing. But let's have a session where we can all talk about metrics in this very open way, where we're talking about what's working or not, and then collaboratively talking about what are we going to do differently, right? And so trying to move forward through processes and setting up this buy-in so that you sort of escalate OKRs. You sort of make them less important because stakeholders and the CEO, etc., they're all getting so much value from these collaborative discussions that the OKRs sort of start to be less important. It's fascinating. I was on a podcast with Leah Theron, and with this. And on this podcast, what we were saying was, I was asking her if she's experienced some of this. And she was also saying that she also finds OKRs hard to work with. And so her answer is, she says, I set objectives and then make the key results less important. Like, that's not what I focus on, which ends up being exactly what I described. Like, this is kind of why we have to take this collaborative learning approach and de-emphasize some of the OKR approach.
A question, because this is so fascinating, right? Like what you described from Leah Theron is like it's a solution to the problem, like not get too stuck to OKR. But I mean, let's say that we get, like, just to unpack and make more concrete what you just said. Let's say that we have given we get from like management team or whomever above us as a product team OKR of increasing retention by 20%. I mean, something like that. Yeah. I mean, that's not completely off the blue. Then what you were describing is that creating, like, from that OKR, so you don't have the possibility of changing that OKR, but you can craft some hypothesis on how the team thinks that we will get to this retention of 20%. And then from those, maybe having, not questioning, but having a conversation about, are the key results correct? Is this the right way that we measure the retention? Where do we see the behavioral change and these kind of things? Did I get it right?
Exactly. And you might have different hypotheses. You might have a hypothesis that says that, if we run this experiment, then we expect the following outcome. because this is the connection between the experiment and the outcome. And maybe that outcome you're measuring is about retention, but maybe that outcome might be, instead of retention, it might be, let's say, increase in signups. It might be something else, right? And being able to talk to management about these different hypotheses and, deciding which ones are you going to prioritize. And over time, being able to say, this hypothesis is looking more important to us than this other one. So you might have set, 20% or whatever other, arbitrary number for retention. But like by talking about these hypotheses and what you're learning along the way, sort of de-emphasizing the 20% and then being able to say, okay, we're increasing retention. And again, I'm not setting targets in my hypotheses. It's more like if we run this experiment, I'm going to see that this retention is going to increase because this is the connection between retention and what's the experiment. Or it might be, between the connection between increase in signups or customer advocacy or whatever else these metrics might be, right? But being able to show different hypotheses and what we're trying, you then de-emphasize this target of 20% retention because you're achieving different things and you realize that what you should be doing is actually something different.
Have you ever experienced because normally those targets, in my experience at least, are a way of measuring progress, but also a way of measuring output, right? I mean, we have we have all these teams, they're working and this is the result, which is like a chain of effect from management board. I mean, a lot of people just want, okay, what's the output of our money that we're investing in this company? What you're describing is instead more of a holistic perspective of not being so fixated in a specific numbers, but actually seeing progress in another perspective, meaning connecting with an hypothesis or more towards a vision. Have you ever experienced a resistance to it? Because we want to measure, because we want to see exactly what's the output here.
Absolutely, right? Because what's important in the end is the quarterly result and that we have to hit this quarterly result. And very often, when we're so output focused, one of the things that happens is that you end up doing really short-term things.
Yeah.
And you've probably experienced this, right?
For sure.
We have a 20% target for retention, and the way we might hit it is by taking on what I call vision debt, where you do things that are short-term, that help you survive, but they're bad for your vision, right? And sometimes, like the holistic approach that I'm describing, requires you to do something that's good for the long-term vision, but it really requires experimenting and seeing what's working, what's not, as opposed to just showing that I hit this 20% number. So some of this has to do with re-education, right? And you have to introduce this concept of vision debt into the organization. Being able to look at and I like to do this visually, to be able to show, stakeholders, CEOs on this axis of vision versus survival. I'm basically showing them the yin and yang of long-term versus short-term, right? And the more you're output driven, and sometimes you keep taking these shortcuts just to be able to focus on output, the more vision debt you take on. And you can do this in the short term, right? I can get this output sometimes by taking on custom features. Like the customer, I promise the customer, I'll build this custom feature for you if you just sign on for another year of renewal, right? And I can get this sort of retention in all sorts of ways, but I've taken on vision debt by doing that, by, for example, taking on this custom feature, right? And we've all done this in the past in our companies. And the question is just, as an organization, how much of this is right for you to do? There's no right answer to that. Maybe what is really important as an organization is just survival because you're in such dire straits. And fine, as an organization, we all agree that we have to take on vision debt. But, If your organization is doing well, if you have the bandwidth to think about it and not be obsessed just for the output, because you're really deteriorating your product every time you take on such vision debt, then, as an organization, you decide thoughtfully, deliberately, how much vision debt are you taking on, do you want to take on, versus experiment more thoughtfully so that you have better longer term results.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much. This could be like 3 other tough questions in there. But if I just summarize, what I take with me with the question, how do I make OKR work? For the first, you still have possibilities, even if you you get an OKR, to transform that and create and craft some hypothesis that will align with the behavior, with customers, and with vision. I also want to talk about or highlight what you just said. I mean, it's about having those conversations. Are we taking vision depths? Are we not taking vision depths? I mean, it's like making them explicit is also something that in my experience, creates conversation and at least gives more, like, if we think that OKR are a solution to define where is the company is going, those conversations as important as like setting OKRs. And most importantly, I would say that it's always good to think about as a company leader, a product manager, individual contributor, everybody. Are we running OKRs or are OKR running us? Because if you have that feeling that you're doing everything just to hit that OKR, you might as well want to ask yourself, is this the right thing to do?
I love this summary. And maybe I'll add one personal note to it, right? Which is that I think people, what I've seen of you, Francesca, and at Productize, I think what you hear in my voice, it's the passion, right? We do our work for the passion that we feel, right? And when we take on so much vision debt, it's soul sucking for us. When we keep doing things that are short term and that is all just about hitting some number, whether or not you believe in it, like it's soul sucking. And so to feel like I want an alternative, that I am going to take this hypothesis-driven approach. I want an environment of collaborative learning where we're genuinely asking the right questions. Is this working? Figuring out how do we do better together? Like that's what ignites us, right? That's what makes our work worth working at. And so, for all of the product people out there, I'd say, don't just give in to OKRs and accept the soul-sucking thing, that this is just a way of life that you have to deal with. By taking this approach, it's a way of combating what you find soul-sucking and find that passion inside, even creating a bubble for your own team. Even if it's the rest of your organization using OKRs, create this happy bubble for you and your team where you're doing some collaborative learning, just so it's not soul-sucking for you.
Oh, plus 100 to that. I mean, I'm all about joy nowadays, like follow your joy. And as much as people are maybe thinking, okay, but what can I do? And just 1 in a million working here, you described it so well. You can create it in your own bubble. You still have your like sphere of influence. And if nothing else, that's where you can find your, anti-soul sucking. I don't know how you would say that, your joy in OKRs.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Radhika, for sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you. And I'd love to do this again.
Yeah, let's pick another tough question. Like, how do you actually create your bubble with OKRs when everyone else is against you? That's going to be for another episode.
And yes, how do we create a bubble for ourselves? I love that. It counts on so many different fronts.
For sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Product Academy Tough Stuff.
We hope today's tough question gave you practical, actionable insights.
If you enjoyed the episode, do us a favor and leave a rating or review. It will help us grow the podcast and make future episodes even better.
Got a question for us? Send an email to toughstuff@productacademy.ch and ask away. We read any submission and might answer yours in a later episode.
Thank you again for listening. We'll see you next time with another tough challenge to tackle.
Until then, take care.